Well, welcome back to our Big Story of the Bible series, and I'm excited about where we are in our journey this week. If you remember back to our very first week, we talked about how almost every good story follows a similar plot, right? That you start where everything is right and good the way it's supposed to be, and then something happens to break that goodness. Right? There's a conflict that comes up. Something goes wrong and there's tension, conflict then between what was and this brokenness in your life or in a system or in a structure, and that tension keeps building and building and building until finally there's this moment, this climax where the final battle occurs, or the final opportunity to make things right again comes, and everything hinges on this moment, right? Either everything's going to work out or everything's going to fall apart. Well, we are to that climax part in the big story of the Bible. Let me remind you of where we were, right? Through that journey. We started with our origin story. This is who we were created to be in relationship with God and each other and creation, and it's beautiful and it's perfect. And then sin and rebellion comes and breaks that perfection and brings conflict between all of those people. And that conflict we saw continues to build and build even as God tries to rebuild that relationship with us again. And that conflict just continues to tear us apart and break these relationships until finally we come to the climax, right? God wants better for us. He wants a perfect relationship again. He's not satisfied, as we saw with Israel, this on again, off again relationship. And so he makes a way. And that brings us to the climax of the story, which comes in 4 books in this one book, right? Remember, many books inside one book? The 4 books are called Gospels. Gospel, that word literally means good news. Good news. The first 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the story of Jesus' life. And they tell us the good news of who Jesus is and what Jesus has done for us. Right? They tell us about how Jesus is the Son of God, come down in human form, who lived a perfect life, never sinned, and then became the perfect sacrifice for our salvation. Right? Remember the Exodus story? Remember during the plagues when the perfect lamb was sacrificed and the blood painted over the doorposts so that the angel of death, that 10th plague, would pass over the people of Israel and they would live. Well, Jesus is that perfect lamb for you and for me. It tells the story of how he is sacrificed on the cross, crucified, painfully, shamefully. And when all seems lost, right? When we think this book is a tragedy, he rises from the dead 3 days later. And he wins complete victory over sin and death and hell and Satan, over our brokenness, right? He sets us free from our guilt and our slavery to sin. Remember? He is our Exodus story. He sets us free from sin and free to a relationship with God. The life of Jesus in the Gospels is evidence of God's love come alive, God's love in action, right? The famous verse of John 3:16 tells us that God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, Jesus, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. So we cannot understand this book without knowing Jesus, without understanding better who he is today. We know him as Jesus Christ, right? That's the name he's given, Jesus Christ. Only we need to realize that that word Christ is not his surname. It's not his last name, like I'm Tony Meyer. He's not Jesus Christ. No. Christ is his title. So Christ is a Greek word, and it means the exact same thing as the Hebrew word Messiah. Messiah and Christ are the same, just in different languages. And they both mean anointed one. And the anointed one was the king. Right? Kings were anointed into their position. So when we say Jesus Christ, when we recognize him as Jesus Christ, we're saying Jesus the King. And he is the King that Isaiah prophesied about in Isaiah chapter 11, when he talked about how a shoot is going to grow out of the stump of Jesse. Right? Jesse is the royal line, the kingly line of Israel, and that tree has been cut off. But from the stump is going to be a shoot. A new king is going to come. That's why you'll notice when you read the Gospels, there's often a genealogy, a family name for Jesus, a family list, history at the beginning of these Gospels. Because it's so important to identify Jesus as part of that family tree, as part of that stump of Jesse, to recognize that he is the shoot that Isaiah prophesied about. He is the coming King, the Messiah, the Christ. And read his story, and you will see that he's a different kind of king. Jesus is the good king. If you read through the Old Testament, when Israel had kings, you'll know that there are plenty of bad kings. There's plenty of kings who don't follow God. And there's plenty of false kings. They are not part of the royal line of David, but through rebellion or through armed conflict, they claim the throne. They claim to be king, but they are not the rightful kings. Well, the arrival of Jesus is the arrival of the real rightful king who comes to bring restoration to his broken kingdom. Did you ever see the movie The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? Or even better, did you ever read the book? In that movie, in that book, you'll get to know the White Queen of Narnia. And the White Queen is the false ruler, the bad ruler of Narnia, right? And as long as she is on the throne, the whole country, the whole land, the whole system suffers, right? She's the White Queen because it's always winter and never spring and never summer. And she rules by cruel force and by fear. And she turns anyone who rebels against her with her wand into stone. And no one, as Mr. Beaver will tell you, no one trusts anyone else. All the system, all the relationships are broken because she's not the rightful ruler. But when Aslan arrives, when he banishes the White Queen and takes his rightful place as the rightful king, as the rightful ruler of Narnia. You read in the book, you see in the movie, that the snow melts and the grass turns green and the flowers bloom again. And when he breathes on them, the people who have been turned to stone come to life again. And relationships of trust and respect are born again. The rightful king comes to bring healing to the land and healing to its people. And that is who Jesus is. That is what Jesus does, and we read about what he's doing in his books, in these Gospels. Jesus is the rightful king who returns to bring restoration, to bring life where there was death, to bring wholeness where there was brokenness. And the gospel stories say this and show this again and again and again. Jesus breathing restoration in life where there was brokenness and death. Right? He meets tax collector Zacchaeus, who's living a broken life. He's a rebel, a tax collector, a traitor working for the enemy. And Jesus meets him, this outcast, and loves him and forgives him and welcomes him home and breathes life into him again. Jesus meets Mary Magdalene, a broken life possessed by 7 demons, an outcast from all society, and Jesus meets her and loves her and frees her from her possession and welcomes her home again, breathes life into her again. Read the stories, and you'll see Jesus meeting lepers and traitors and foreigners and people who are broken physically or emotionally or spiritually, and he loves them and values them and welcomes them home again and breathes life into them when there was only brokenness and death. And they come alive after being turned to stone. Jesus is the good king, the rightful king, who comes to bring life and newness again, to offer restoration to his whole world and to you and to me. He comes to breathe his life on us and give us life again, wholeness from our brokenness. And he makes that restoration possible by becoming the crucified king. Think about it. What's the greatest symbol of the Christian faith? My guess is an image of a cross came to mind, which we've come to believe is normal, right? The symbol of the Christian faith is the cross, yeah? But it's so strange, right? Because a cross is a symbol of brokenness and in a brutal execution. It's a tool of torture, right? It's an especially cruel form of torture. It's horribly painful, extends your death into a long, torturous death. But the imagery, as you are hung above the earth, communicates that you are wanted by neither heaven nor earth. You're suspended between both, and you are not welcome anywhere. The cross becomes the center of this story because Jesus transforms it from a symbol of torture and execution to a symbol of God's great love. The cross is the deepest expression of God's love for you and for me. Right? The cross is our rightful punishment for the sin that we chose. For the rebellious life that we live, we turn our back to God. We walk away from our relationship with God, the King. And the cross, death, is our rightful punishment. We're guilty. If you read from earlier weeks the suggested passages from Deuteronomy, you know that the consequences for rebelling against God are not pretty. Right? They bring us to a cross where honestly we are wanted neither by earth nor by heaven. But Jesus, the King, our King, chooses to step in front of us and to take our place on that cross, to die on our cross. He suffers and he dies in our place so that we don't have to. Our King pays the price for our sin. And he does that out of love. He chooses this. He allows this out of love. Right? Remember Genesis 3:15 that we read back in our origin story? The Genesis 3:15 promise that God puts into the curse that he gives to the serpent. This is what Jesus said, what God said. He said, I will put enmity between you and the woman, enmity or hatred, between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. The cross is Satan bruising, striking Jesus' heel. Now, that's a pretty significant bruising, a pretty significant strike. And it should have been me. It should have been you. The cross is the punishment that I deserve for my rebellion, for my sin against a perfectly holy God. It's what I deserve, but it's what Jesus chose. He chose to suffer in my place so that I wouldn't have to. That is love. That is grace. That is amazing. The climax of the story. But it's only half the story, right? It's the striking of the heel half. Because 3 days later, when you keep reading the Gospels, 3 days later after the cross, Jesus walks out of his tomb alive again. This time not as the crucified king, but as the healing king. Right? This is the crushing of the head part of the story. You see, at the cross, at the darkness of the cross, Satan celebrated because he thought he had won. But just when it seemed like he had, like all was lost. And the disciples are hidden. They've given up. They're going to go back to being fishermen. Just when it seems like all is lost, like the story's a tragedy, Jesus walks out of that tomb alive and celebrates the final victory, the crushing of Satan's head. Right? So following the darkness of the crucifixion comes the cosmic sunrise of the resurrection, which changes everything, which brings healing to all of those relationships that were broken back in Genesis chapter 3. Because of the empty cross and because of the empty tomb, because of what Jesus has done, our relationship with God can be healed and restored. There is grace and forgiveness given to you from God. There is a way for us to be in relationship with him again, perfectly. And because of what Jesus has done, our relationships with each other can be healed and restored. We can learn how to forgive as we have been forgiven. We learn how to give grace to each other as we have received grace. We learn how to love each other again because we learn how we are loved from God. And because of what Jesus has done, our relationship with this creation around us can be healed and restored as we love God and we love each other by enjoying and caring for this creation God has given us. Our Jesus walked out of that tomb on that first Easter morning as our healing King, making a way to put the brokenness of our relationships, the broken pieces of our lives back together again. And that healing process in your life and in my life can begin right now, right here. Yes, it will not be completed until the final healing renewal happens when Jesus comes back again. But we start that healing process. We start that renewal process. We start that life from death process right now. We get a taste of heaven while we're living here on earth as we experience the brokenness being put back together again. Jesus, the good King, the crucified King, the healing King, has arrived. He lived, he died, he rose from the dead to put the broken pieces of our lives back together again, to restore the relationships that were broken, to give you peace, right? The shalom we've been talking about, the wholeness that we were created to experience. That is the center of this whole story. It's the center of Jesus. You read the story, at the core is Jesus and an empty cross and an empty tomb. And you cannot fully understand what you read before that in this book. And you cannot fully understand what you read after that in this book without understanding Jesus. You can't receive the gift of grace, of forgiveness, of restoration from God without understanding and receiving Jesus. This big story of the Bible doesn't make sense without Jesus. Without Jesus being God's Son, not just a good teacher. It doesn't make sense without Jesus living a perfect, sinless life, not just a moral life. It doesn't make sense without Jesus dying and rising to life again, not just symbolically, but literally and physically. It doesn't make sense without Jesus now reigning as victorious King and ruler of all things, and who also profoundly loves you and knows every detail of your life. It doesn't make sense without Jesus. But when we, in faith, believe that Jesus is who he said he was, when we, in faith, believe that he will restore and heal our brokenness, and that his love and his grace are enough to set us free from our guilt and our sin, then the big story of the Bible becomes our greatest celebration. It becomes our greatest joy. It becomes the greatest confidence and assurance that we can have in this life. And it becomes our strength for today, for every day, and for eternity. It becomes what breathes life into us. So let me give you this invitation. If you haven't taken up the invitation that I've been giving over the last few weeks to read this book a little more thoroughly throughout this series, that's okay. I'll give you another opportunity, a new invitation. Over the next 3 weeks, before we finish this series, read the story of Jesus' life. Pick one of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. I'd recommend John. And read about Jesus. Read it at your own pace, however fast, however slow. But read the story. That's central. That's core. That's the climax to this whole book. And get to know Jesus, who he is, what he's done, and his immense love for you. If you don't read anything else, read the story of Jesus. Get to know his story. Because when you get to know his story, then you will discover your story. You'll discover how you can come to life when Jesus breathes life into you. You will discover how the brokenness of your life can be put together again by the healing power of Jesus. And you'll discover how your relationships with God, with each other, and this world can be restored by the grace and the power and the forgiveness that Jesus won for you on the cross. Read his story and accept his gift, his great gift of love. Amen.